Can I go ahead now? And the camera that I should look into is the one directly in front of. Welcome everyone to the second day of our seminars in economics 2021. We were so happy that we have some returning residents. I know Morant Bay High is in the house and welcoming our new guests. And we do hope that these sessions today will be informative and they will put you in good stead for those upcoming exams. Our first presenter is Mr. Cordell Wright. He is from Knox College, so if there's any Knox College on YouTube, hey, Knox College. He'll be speaking on inflation. Now, please sit back, relax. We are going to mute you, those who are joining us on Microsoft Teams, but you can always put your questions in the chat, and he will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. And those on YouTube, if you have not yet, please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to Bank of Jamaica's YouTube channel. Enjoy the presentations.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cordell Wright, Senior Economist at the Bank of Jamaica in the Inflation and Monetary Analysis Unit. This morning, I'll be walking with you through this concept of inflation, which has become a very important aspect of our daily lives. The presentation will take the following outline. We'll begin by looking on a basic definition of inflation, followed by its measurement and causes. We'll conclude by looking on the impact of inflation on our economy, as well as policy measures to control inflation and how inflation has been in Jamaica in recent time. When I was doing my CAPE units 1 and 2, my favorite definition of inflation was uttered by Milton Friedman in 1963. He was a popular, and some would say the leading economist in the monetarism school of thought. His definition was that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But we have learned much since 1963, and we have also learned that inflation is not only a monetary phenomenon. There are many aspects many different factors that contribute to inflation in any economy, and it varies from one economy to the next. But a very formal and all-encompassing definition is that inflation is a sustained increase in the aggregate or general level of prices for goods and services in an economy over a period of time. Ceteris paribus, inflation results in a loss of purchasing power. That is, a decline in the quantity of goods and services that can be purchased with a given amount of money. Because of inflation, every dollar that you have in your possession will buy smaller and smaller amount of goods and services over a period of time. The real quantity of goods that you can purchase will go down. For example, if we have an annual inflation rate of 10%, when you entered lower sixth form, in a year's time, a lunch that had cost you $500 will cost you about $550 in a year. 2 years after you entered sixth form, that lunch is gonna cost you $605. Can you imagine applying 10% interest rate not only to your lunch, but to the cost of your books, to the cost of your transport, to the cost of your uniform and other school expenses? Alternatively, if we had a 5% annual inflation rate, for example, the cost of that lunch will increase from $500 in year one to $525 after a year, and around $550 after 2 years. So imagine that big shift because the rate of inflation is now half than the previous scenario. So inflation pretty much dictates many things about what we do. It will affect, based on your level of income, where you will live. Will you stay at home with your parents? Will you rent a condo? Will you rent a 2 or 3 bedroom house? How will you go about transporting yourselves? Will you take public transport? Will you be able to afford a car and petrol? How often will you be able to go on vacation? Inflation has far and wide-reaching implications for you and me. But how is the inflation rate measured? Well, there are 3 popular ways in which it is used, the first of which is the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. For this approach, prices of a fixed basket of goods and services for an average consumer are surveyed, and the change in the cost of this basket is compared over time. So what the statistics agency would do for us in Statin, they would survey individuals. Usually it's the middle income earner, the average income earner in the island. And they would look on the items that those households consume the most. They would create a hypothetical basket of goods that would range from food to utilities, clothing, health, and so on. After getting the initial price for these items in the basket of goods, they would track the prices over time and create an index from each different data point that they collect for prices. From this index that's created over time, the inflation rate is calculated as the percentage change along any 2 points on this index. But we'll get into this some more later. Another popular measure that can be used is the Producer Price Index, or PPI. It is also referred to as a wholesale price index. Whereas the CPI looks on the prices of goods and services from the perspective of consumers, the PPI looks on prices from the perspective of manufacturers. Finally, the most comprehensive measurement of inflation that can be used is the GDP Deflator. It is more comprehensive because it measures the average price level of the entire economy and its output. It doesn't just stop at the prices of a fixed basket of goods or a number of goods that is consumed by the final consumer. It also looks on the prices of investment goods, government services, export minus the price of imports. The drawback with the GDP deflator is that even though it is more comprehensive in terms of its coverage, it is more difficult to update this measurement every month. Because imagine trying to get the prices of goods and services for the entire economy, for everything produced in the economy, goods and services and investment, government services. It will be very difficult to do on a month-by-month basis. The CPI, however, is able to achieve this higher frequency, which is why it is the most popular measurement that is used by policymakers around the world. So, what are the causes of inflation? Well, there are 2 general theories that are accepted by policymakers and economists. One is that the demand effect on inflation that we call the demand pull inflation. This can be described in terms saying too much money chasing too few goods, or demand rising faster than supply. To understand this concept, remember your factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. A lot of those factors are fixed in the short run when it comes to producing a certain level of goods and services. So supply is relatively fixed in the short run. However, demand can change more quickly relative to the supply of goods and services in the economy. You and your friends can be unemployed today, and by just getting one job interview in the week, you're employed next week. That new income for you will now translate into an increase in demand because of your new ability and willingness to pay and consume. So, because demand changes so quickly relative to supply, it's easy for demand to affect inflation in the near term. Another generally accepted theory is the cost push inflation. When a company's costs go up, it will need to increase prices to maintain its profit margin. This, of course, is in a context where the firm is unable to absorb the cost. The market structure that the firm is in is not highly competitive like a perfect competition economy, and the commodity itself is not very elastic. So companies, when faced with higher costs, in order to maintain a profit, because that's why they're in operation in the first place, to make a profit, for taking the risk as the entrepreneur, to satisfy their shareholders. So to maintain a certain amount of profitability, increasing costs will have to be passed on sometimes to the final prices and to the consumers. These increased costs can include domestic factors such as wages, taxes, the cost of raw materials or labor locally. It could be because of some adverse impact like weather. All of those could affect the domestic costs that the company face, as well as the source could be international. We import a lot of raw materials in our manufacturing process, and a lot of our final goods that we consume are imported. And if those prices go up significantly, then it would be passed on to the local CPI index and the inflation. Another lens through which we can look at the phenomenon of inflation is to analyze the Phillips Curve, which shows a short-run relationship between unemployment and inflation in the economy. So remember, on the previous slide, we discussed how demand can affect inflation in the short run because supply is relatively fixed. And the reasoning behind the Phillips Curve is along that line as well. There is a relationship, because there is an inverse relationship, changes in the level of unemployment have a direct and predictable effect on the level of inflation in the economy. So government can decide that they want a little bit more inflation for good reasons, as we'll discuss later. They could want a little bit more inflation, and they could achieve this by reducing the unemployment rate. By reducing the unemployment rate, you now have more individuals, more consumers with who didn't have an income before, now having a new source of income and a willingness and ability to spend. And that would contribute to higher inflation rate. Alternatively, a government could decide that the inflation rate is too high, and they could decide to lower the inflation rate, but it may come at the expense of a higher unemployment rate. So policymakers can exploit a trade-off between unemployment and inflation and find what optimally can work for their economy. A fiscal stimulus can be used. Fiscal meaning from the government side as it concerns taxes and government spending. So for example, the government could decide to run a slightly more expansionary policy that would be increasing government spending, having some more road works, construction, debushing, you name it, just to put money in the hands of more individuals. Or they could reduce taxes, GCT or income taxes, which we have seen in recent time. That would have the effect of increasing aggregate demand, reducing unemployment, increasing nominal wages, and finally, prices. Some other terms that come up often when we are discussing inflation is deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. It is a sustained decline in the general price level. We have hyperinflation, which is unusually rapid inflation, and in extreme cases, this can lead to a breakdown in monetary system, in a nation's monetary system. In most recent times, we see this happening in Venezuela, where I think the highest annual point-to-point that they have was in 2018 so far, when I checked. It was 130,000 was their inflation rate, annual point-to-point. So to put that into context, over the past year, our inflation rate has been between 4 and 6%, averaging around 5 or thereabouts. So imagine an inflation rate of 130,000%. That means if you have some money under your mattress from last year, when you take out that lump sum, it has pretty much no value, right? And that's what we see happening. People pretty much just discarding the notes because it has no value. And this has happened in the past to many other countries. You can read it up. It happened to Zimbabwe. It happened to Germany back in the 1920s, I believe. So it's really a catastrophic event. We also have stagflation, which is a situation where the inflation rate is high, economic growth is low, and the unemployment rate remains steadily high. And this is usually due to some supply shock that is outside the control of policymakers. So, what are the impacts of inflation on our economy? Well, we can classify some of these impacts in terms of microeconomic and macroeconomic. Microeconomic meaning on individual households and businesses. Real wages would decline. So, if you live off a fixed income, which most of us do, our wages don't change every month. It's usually after a year or 2 years. If you live in a high inflationary environment, then you're going to be worse off because your nominal wage will be able to do less over time. The value of your wealth will decline. There will be income redistribution challenges, especially when it concerns lenders and borrowers. On the macroeconomic side, we'll have uncertainty, shortened horizons, and increased speculation. And also we'll have a worsening of the current account deficit because of the large imbalance between imports and exports that we'll have. So, as I said before, fixed income persons would suffer the most because their real wages will decline. So, if your wage rate doesn't change often in a high inflation economy, you're going to be worse off. If you are retired and you have to live based on your pension, you're going to be worse over time, unless you have some other savings or asset that appreciates to match inflation. One concept that presents itself for individuals is called the money illusion, where you can get an increase in your nominal wage. So for example, say your wage in 1 year is $1 million, and your boss decides to grant you a 5% increase in your wage. So now your wage goes up to $1,050,000. If the inflation rate is 1.6%, so the percentage change between 100 and 101.6, so the inflation rate is 1.6%, your real wage is actually not going to be plus 50,000, it's just going to be plus about 33,000. Alternatively, if you are given a 5% wage increase, but the inflation rate is 10%, then your real wage is not going to be 50,000 more. It's actually going to be less than what it was in year one, right? So a high inflationary environment usually creates this sort of a problem. The individual thinks he's better off because he gets a wage increase, but after they start spending for a period of time, they'll actually see that they're worse off, and the money illusion dissipates. You also have loss of wealth, as I said. If you have all your wealth in cash underneath your mattress, you are going to be worse off and adversely affected if you live in a high inflationary environment, because, again, the nominal value is going to be able to do less over a period of time. It would help if you have some sort of investment, whether land or some other financial instrument, that at least appreciates with inflation, so you're insured against it. We'll have redistribution issues if prices are going up and your income is fixed for a long period of time. You'll become poorer. This might contribute for those who depend on informal and infrequent employment. You might have more social ills like crime. You'll have increased poverty. It might affect literacy rates over time, and so on. And then as it concerns lenders and borrowers, the problem is that when an individual like a bank or some other financial institution wants to give credit or to give a loan, the interest rate, in simply put, has a component in it to cover the lender against inflation, because they don't want, when they get back the money, it can't do anything. So they include a component in the interest rate to cover inflation, and also another component is there to guarantee them some return on the loan that they're giving. If inflation comes out higher than the lender had anticipated, then the lender is going to be worse off, right? Because the money that he'll receive is going to be doing less than what he had anticipated. So if inflation is higher than anticipated, the lender will lose, but the borrower will gain, because the funds that he received at the time, he could do more with it than now when he's ready to pay back, right? And the converse is true. If inflation is lower than anticipated, the lender will gain and the borrower will lose. So practically what comes out of this scenario is that in high inflationary environment, financial institutions tend to have I don't want to say exorbitant, but a significantly higher lending rate, because they want to insure themselves against inflation coming out higher than they had anticipated. So this is in instances where you just can't forecast inflation. It's 1% this year, it's 10% or 15% in a year or two time, and a lot of loans are over 5 and 10 year periods. So in high inflationary environments, financial institutions tend to have higher lending rate. And we saw that in the past in Jamaica, where if you wanted a loan, the rates were significantly higher than they actually are now. On the macroeconomic side, businesses will be affected because there is just so much uncertainty. When a businessman is making a decision, he's looking 5, 10, 15 years down the line, to go to this particular plot of land, to build up a factory, to employ staff, to start a new line of products, right? But if you live in an environment where you don't know what the value of money is going to be 5 or 10 years from now, it's a bit harder to plan. It's a bit harder to budget how you're going to increase your prices. Will you even be able to increase your prices to recover your investment based on the market structure or the area or the sector that you're in? So the uncertainty makes businesses and consumers reluctant to spend, and this affects economic output. And you will have shortened horizons generally where persons stay away from long-term commitments because there's a decline in the faith of what the economy will be like in the future. You'll have more speculation, persons, trying to guess and spell what the state is going to be like, what is interest rate going to be like, what is inflation going to be like. And then you'll have less efficient decisions being made, which pretty much results in a self-fulfilling cycle. You anticipate a bad decision, and if everyone collectively makes a cautious decision now, then economically, especially for output, it can make a bad situation actually worse. So how can we combat inflation? Well, as my colleague would have discussed in our first days of presentation, one thing that can be done, especially from the aspect of the central bank, is to affect interest rates, affect the availability of credit, affect the circulation of funds in the economy, right? So if policymakers decide that they want a lower pace of inflation, then they would hike the interest rate, and essentially what they would be doing is limiting the flow of credit in the financial system and limiting the economic growth and spending and so on. On the flip side, if policymakers want a slightly faster rate of inflation, which can be good depending on your economy, then one policy action would be to cut interest rates, encourage banks to give out more loans for businesses, give out more loans for companies, give out for consumers, give out more loans for expansion and new business and so on. And this would contribute to higher growth, more demand, and faster inflation. Another avenue that the central bank can use is by influencing expectations. Because if you think about, one way you can think about inflation is that the inflation that we get in any period is as a result of what we say macroeconomic factors, so your exchange rate, your cost of imports, and so on. But expectations is also a variable that comes into play. If a businessman, for example, expects inflation to be high next year, then he's going to start building in higher prices in his products from now. If he expects next year to be a good year and prices to be stable where he can plan, then he's likely to have more stable increases or not building so much increase in his prices, to put simply. So expectations is a big part of influencing inflation, and this is not affected by the interest rate. It's more relying on moral suasion and the credibility of the central bank. If the central bank is not credible and he says next year inflation is going to be 5%, then nobody will listen to what the governor or the senior deputy governor is saying, because the bank is not credible. But if the bank is credible, and I hope that we are, then when we say inflation is going to be between 4 and 6 over the next 2 years, and that we hope will influence all agents in the economy to behave in a particular manner. Outside the central bank, fiscal policy can also be used. And remember, by fiscal, we're talking about government spending and their tax packages. So if the government thinks, or the fiscal authority thinks, that inflation is too high, then they could enact policies such as a higher income tax. They could cut back on government spending, and this would reduce aggregate demand, leading to lower growth and less demand, pulling inflation. And the opposite is also true. If they want a little more inflation, then they would do stuff like lower income tax and increase government spending. On top of those two, you could also see a case where supply-side policies are used, such as increasing long-term competitiveness. Example, privatizing some agencies, or deregulation that may help to reduce the cost of businesses, leading to lower inflation. Also, for some countries like Jamaica, who we're dependent heavy, or we have sectors that are prone to shocks on a frequent basis, coming in with some other policies that would help us be more resistant to shocks, like expanding the value chain that's in the country. With agriculture, for example, every year there's normally a drought or too much rain. Both of those contribute to higher prices for vegetables and starchy foods, which feeds through to employment, to inflation. But what if we had like cold storage, for example, or some other avenue that would help, or better irrigation systems that would help to allow the sector to be more resilient to shocks, so stuff like that. So what has inflation looked like in Jamaica? What measure do we use in Jamaica and why? So as I hinted at before, we use the CPI mostly in terms of what is reported in the media. We have other measures, but it's mostly the CPI that is reported to the media. The official agency to do that is the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, Statin. They use the CPI to measure average price of, as I said before, a fixed basket of goods and services that is representative of middle and low income households in Jamaica. Currently, and this is based on the recent revision that they did, price movements of over 318 items are included, goods and services. And items that doesn't consider brands, if you include like brands and so on, then it's much more than that. And these are classified into 13 main divisions and 3 geographical regions. So they have a CPI for the Greater Kingston metropolitan area, other urban centers, and rural areas. Using the CPI means that there needs to be some revision periodically, because as you can guess, there are changes in expenditure patterns over a period of time. So every now and then, every 10 years or so, there has to be a relook on the basket of goods and the spending patterns. You'll also have changes in the quality of products. New commodities will enter the market, and some commodities will no longer be popular for consumers, or not as popular for consumers. So adjustments will have to be made. The latest revision was done in terms of the new CPI in 2019-2020. Before that, the previous revision, I believe, was in 2006. And to get the information that they need to create the new basket, they conducted a household expenditure survey, which is just how they collect the data, and that was done in 2017. So Statin would, having collected the information from the household expenditure survey, they would come up with a comprehensive list of consumer goods and services associated with specific quantities, and this is what goes into our basket. Then they track the prices monthly and compute an index, a CPI, from those numbers. The inflation rate now is just looking on the change, the percentage change in that index for any 2 period of time. So you could have a monthly inflation where you look on what the prices generally for the economy are this month relative to last month. So it's just the percentage change of the index from this month relative to last month. You could look at the point-to-point inflation, which is how are prices in March 21 relative to prices in March 20. And you could do this for every month, look at the point-to-point inflation for every month. As well as you could do annual average inflation, which looks at the average CPI for 1 year versus the year before. Because you can use any 2 points, of course, you could do a quarterly inflation or track inflation every 3 months. You could look on 6 months inflation. You could look at inflation for when you started high school compared to the present time now. So it's really versatile that way. Just to share that from the last household expenditure survey, what is displayed here is the proportion. We refer to them as the weights of items in the basket. But it's really looking at the budget of a household. How is that budget broken out into what you consume? And about 36% of that budget is for food and non-alcoholic beverages. I think in this alone, food is about 33%. Then you have your expenses related to housing, water, electricity, and gas. So this would have like your water rate, your electricity bill, your gas for your cooking, your rent, and general maintenance for your home. You have your transport costs, which would have your fare, bus fare, taxi fare, plane fare, and also if you drive, the cost of petrol. And then you have other stuff like clothing, education, recreation, information, communication, and so on. So they have 13 divisions. So looking at inflation for Jamaica, so the chart here is showing the inflation rate. Remember, it's in percent. And this is showing inflation, and this is annual inflation. So for every month, based on the CPI, what is it saying for the level of prices for this particular month, for example, September 2009, relative to September 2008, right? So that's what this chart is showing. And it's saying that in 2010, prices were closer to 14%, right? But since then, we've had a gradual decline in prices. It's not going to be a straight line because things happen every month that some items in the basket are going up, some items are going down. The increase in this month is bigger and it overshadows everything that goes down and so on. So it's going to be more wavy because you have some volatile items in there like your petrol and your light bill and food prices. And then you have some stable items in there as well, but everything is just kind of combined here. But generally, we've had a decline a trend decline. If you were to plot a straight line for the trend line, you'd see that we'd have a decline in inflation for the past decade or so. And then remember that I said that, the central bank would be doing stuff. The fiscal authorities would be doing policies also to help control inflation. So for example, between January 2008 and June 2009, so it's somewhere in the back that you can see, the BOJ had increased rates significantly. Why? Because the inflation rate was too high and they wanted the inflation rate to come down, right? There is some lag, so it's not like we increase the rate today and then inflation is affected tomorrow, because remember, everything has to pass through the financial system, pass through credit, pass through businesses and spending and so on. So it's over a period of time. So that would have contributed to inflation being lower when we reach further up in around 2011, 2012. I mean, you also have stuff like standby agreements that we had with the IMF. That was in 2010 and 2011. We had fiscal consolidation along the way, which is, simply put, the government being more mindful of how they spend. Don't spend more than you actually collect or go too far above, because then you're going to have to borrow, and that's going to cause a host of other problems, right? So a lot of the policies that were enacted around this time or before would have contributed to prices trending down recently. And then also, inflation can be affected by external factors. So we had a period where oil prices were extremely low. So that would affect electricity bills, water bills, petrol. It would also affect the input costs of businesses that are energy intensive. If for some particular reason you wanted to look behind what's going on with the overall inflation rate, you could, if data is available. So you could pull out food alone to see what's happening to food overall. You could look at what's happening to vegetables and starchy foods. You could look at vegetables alone if you wanted to. Some variables are going to be more volatile. So when you see a variable moving sharply up and down, we say it's a volatile variable. It's harder to predict and forecast a volatile variable. And then some are not so volatile. For example, clothing, since about 2015-16, it hasn't been as volatile as it has been in the past. It's been pretty low to around about 2% up until 2020. So this 2% is on average considering clothing in the economy. how much have they increased over time. If you can't relate to this 2%, just remember that it's looking for the entire economy and not just the pants and the shirt that you buy. So this is just another view of the 13 divisions that our CPI basket is broken out into. So it's able to track annual inflation, monthly, quarterly for all of these items. So inflation is now even more important. It has always been important to the BOJ. It's important for every central bank, but formally it's even more important now because effective April 2021, the BOJ is formally operating under an inflation targeting regime. The bank's primary mandate now is the maintenance of price stability and secondarily to financial system stability. So the inflation targeting is a monetary policy in which the authority assesses a desirable level of inflation and explicitly announce, so every quarter we do a press briefing. At the start of every, fiscal year, we reiterate what our inflation target is, right? And then we utilize policies and tools, usually but not limited to the interest rates, to direct actual inflation to this target. So this type of framework is a bit more transparent in terms of economic agents, businesses, consumers, financial agents, and so on, understanding what the BOJ is about or what a central bank is about, and they would know what to expect, right? Because if inflation is, after we define a particular target, and you know the policy tools that we have, you know how we see the relationship between interest rates, for example, and inflation, then if inflation is running high for a period of time, then you know what the central bank is likely to do. If inflation is too low for a long period of time, then you know what the central bank is likely to do. So the primary objective of most central banks is price stability. However, historically, monetary policy has sought to achieve this stability by targeting fundamental factors such as stock of money, so they might be more on the monetarism side, changes in the exchange rate, or looking on general output. Or they might just use a mix of any affecting any fundamental variable. So a lot of central banks don't really commit to any explicit policy. They just pretty much use their discretion to change strategy as the need arises. However, this can have some drawback. It's harder to plan if you don't know what your central bank is going to be doing to the interest rate, how they're going to affect the flow of funds and the availability of credit in the economy. So with inflation targeting, we target inflation directly and not the intermediary variables, right? And the aim of inflation targeting is to, because the BOJ can't achieve everything in the economy on its own, the aim is to create an environment that would support the desirable effects that we want, right? So how much inflation is desirable? So numerous studies have been done. High inflation is bad, right? So that's that given. There's no way around that. And researchers have found that above 10% is bad for most economy. However, there exists a threshold for your particular economy or for a particular type of economy for which some inflation is actually good, right? Some economists actually go as far as to say zero inflation is as bad as 10% or over 10%. But it kind of depends on your particular economy. There is no one size fits all. But most agree that a desirable value lies between 0 and 8%, depending on the characteristics of that economy. For Jamaica, our main trading partners average inflation rates between 2 and 7%. So on the lower end of that, you will find the larger economies like the US and Canada and the UK. So their inflation would be closer to 2. And then some of the smaller trading partners would be on the other side of this range. For Jamaica, when we're approaching the concept of inflation targeting, our optimal range we found was between 4 and 6%. And this range was deemed optimal because, again, considering our size or our degree of openness and what else did we want to achieve. We wanted to achieve long-run growth trajectory, a certain long-run growth trajectory. And we also wanted a rate that is consistent with a programmed reduction in the public debt. So remember, in economics, everything is connected. So the inflation target range that was selected based on other desirable macroeconomic factors that we wanted to achieve. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you have learned a lot. To test yourself, you can try and answer this question. Imagine that the interest rate of your savings account is 1% per year and inflation is 2% per year. After 1 year, how much would you be able to buy with the money in this account? More than today, exactly the same, or less than today? If you can't answer that question, go on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe, or rewatch this presentation or the others from day one. What was Jamaica's annual point-to-point inflation rate in March 21? What does this number mean in general terms? What do we expect the rate of inflation in Jamaica to be over the next 12 months? If you can answer this question, feel free to rewatch the presentation. I wish you all good luck. I hope you have learned a lot or have solidified some of the concepts that you would have already known. So good luck on your exams. Thank you.
You enjoyed that presentation on inflation. Now, the next thing we're going to do, if you have questions now, you can write it in the chat, and Mr. Wright will be very happy to respond to all your questions. He did challenge you. And all my YouTubers, you can also type in the chat. We're monitoring YouTube. All right. I don't see any questions up yet. I am, as usual, typing in my email. So if you want a copy of the email, you can do that. Just send to my email, sandra.moody@boj.org.am.
It's right there in the chat, and you can always email me and ask me for a copy of the presentation and any other presentation. And to my YouTube family, I saw 213 views yesterday, so that's great. I hope you enjoy the rest of this. And remember, it's streaming on YouTube, so please, any presentation that you want to listen to again, watch again, go right ahead. Okay, people on Teams, we're doing a little break before our other presentation. We are slated to start at 11 o'clock. So you have a little time to go through the presentations. Send me a message if you need another copy, or you can just write it in the chat. And we'll restart at 11.
Alpha. Yeah. 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 It's the Convent of Mercy Academy. No man, sister trained us well. We were trained well. So Sandra, let them know that we're giving away credit. Both visitors and flow. So good.
Yeah.